So really great to see everybody. Thank you so much for coming along to this session. We have done a similar session last year at Groundswell with a slightly different group of farmers, and it was absolutely brilliant. So you are in for a treat this afternoon. My name's Nikki Oxall. I'm Head of Research at Pasture for Life and also run Grampian Graziers. And I will be explaining a little bit about the project that we're involved in, and then I'll be handing over to these four wonderful people. So I will let them introduce themselves. But just very quickly, we have Ian Steele, Claire Beaumont, Ian Horsley and Silas Headley-Lawrence, who are all farmers involved in our Innovative Farmers Bale Grazing project. So a little bit about Bale Grazing and a little bit about the project, and then I will hand over to these guys to talk about the very specific context on their farms. We will go through the presentations and then we will be taking questions. So if you have questions that you want to ask, hold on to them, write them down, keep them in your minds and ask them as we have space at the end for that opportunity. So the first thing to say is, what is bale grazing? Well, it's a practice that is becoming increasingly common in the UK, and it's really great every winter to see more and more farmers engaging in this practice. It predominantly kind of originated it's probably something that is not that far away from feeding hayricks out on fields when hay was cut hundreds of years ago, and as they say, there's nothing new under the sun. But as a practice, bale grazing really has been growing in North America, particularly in Canada and the US, as an outwintering strategy, particularly in areas that get very, very cold, pretty harsh winters. It's a very low-cost way of wintering cattle. People are also using this approach with sheep. The farmers that are involved in this project are cattle focused. And the project is looking at bale grazing as a cattle outwintering strategy. But if you have sheep questions, we've got folk here who could also pick up on those as well. But basically, it's where you cut hay and or silage, but we're predominantly looking at hay. You put your bales out in the place that you're going to feed them during the winter. Some of us are putting them out at the point that they're cut and baled. Others are putting them out later in the year. But generally, they're already out there when you get to your winter grazing. And the bales are then grazed in situ, but without any ring feeders. So the idea either is that you can graze them on end, or bean can, as we might call it, so they're kind of sitting on their end, and animals are grazing around them, a bit like if there was a ring feeder, but without the feeder barrier. Or most of us are rolling those bales out. So we get the bale, tip it on its side, unwrap the netting, and just roll it out. And that means that all of the animals are able to graze along the length of that bale. And there's lots of different reasons for doing this, but what we found was that in the UK, there had been absolutely no research into this practice. Nobody had been looking at this. Most academics don't really know it exists, and it just hadn't in any way been explored. So we approached Innovative Farmers a couple of years ago and said this is something that more and more people are doing, and we would really like some support to start actually understanding what is the benefit to the soil health and also to the forage quality after bale grazing. Because anecdotally, what we were hearing from farmers who were doing this was that the grass was coming back better than ever, and that they were able to get an even better hay cut, they were able to get a better graze the following year, an extra graze the following year, and we were also interested in what was the impact on soil health. So we did a bit of digging and found that in Canada there had been some research done about 10 years ago. There has since been other research undertaken, but this particular research allowed us to copy their protocol, so their experimental protocol, and we've applied that into our settings. So that experiment was done on farms, on real farms, and we've basically copied that. And each of the farmers is doing soil sampling and forage assessments over a period of 5 years following the first year of bale grazing. There were real differences and contextual challenges between the different farms, so it's not as rigorous as an experiment, a sort of scientific experiment, but it's a great way for us to get an initial indicator of what's going on. There's been so much interest in this, so it's not just Innovative Farmers funding it. AHDB have also become involved and have since funded a cost-benefit analysis as well, which is just being undertaken at the moment, and we've had some very, very early initial feedback from the consultants doing that. And there's definitely interest in exploring animal welfare and also human well-being implications of the practice as well. So we're really excited that this is a 5-year project. We've still got 4 years left to run, but there's lots of opportunity to explore all different aspects of this approach. So very quickly, a little bit about the farmers that are involved. So we have 7 farms that are taking part. It was just 6. And then one of the AHDB monitor farms kind of muscled in. They wanted to get in on the action. So we said, as long as AHDB pay for that, they're more than welcome to get involved. So we're really excited to have Annan Farm, so that's the Swordies in Northumberland, join our group. But we have, I mean, these guys will talk about where they are geographically, but we have farms in Oxfordshire, Aberdeenshire, Shropshire, Cumbria, the Scottish borders, Worcestershire and Northumberland. So we've got quite a good spread across England and also into Scotland. All of them are Pasture for Life members at least, and I think 4 are certified. So there's very much a Pasture for Life link in this. They vary between 58 metres above sea level to 520 metres above sea level. So there's a real variation in terms of how high these farms are. And we have a mix of farms that are on sandy and clay loams, medium clays, iron podzols and heavy clay. So a real mix of different soil types. What we wanted to do was not have that issue of, well, it's all very well and good that you can do this on X soil, but what about this soil? So we tried to get a mix of soil types. We've also got a range of average rainfall for the farms. So they go from 660 mil average a year to 1,675. So we've got really, and that actually this year will be probably like 2 metres of rain for you, I guess, Claire in Cumbria. And we've also got a range of herd sizes from around 30 head to 300. So we've got a really, really broad kind of spectrum of animal group size. We also have, one of our farms also runs deer on a Bale Grazing system as well. So that's Stuart Mitchell up at Whitriggs, and so he's brought deer into the study as well. So it's 7 farms, but actually with 8 groups, if you like. Almost all of them are not now doing any housing. So for the group that were Bale grazed, I think one of you guys housed for like 5 days because of TB testing 2 years ago or something. Someone else housed for 70 days and someone else housed for 30 days, but the rest of them, there was no housing involved. And we have been, so as I said, we're kind of 1 year into the study. The things that we're looking at are soil carbon, but we're doing that through organic matter. Rather than doing a Dumas test, we decided to go for loss on ignition because that was what was done in the Canadian study. So we wanted to see if we were able to draw similarities and comparisons. We're also looking at forage quality, so sending off the grass that grows after Bale grazing for analysis. We're looking also at the soils at pH and available nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. What are we doing?
Potash.
Potash, sorry, NPK. Sorry, I was having a moment then. And I think all of us are using hay. Some have used silage in the past, but we're all now using hay in this study. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an overview of what Bale grazing is. It will make more sense when you start seeing some photos. So what we're going to do is go through each of the farms. They're going to just present for about 10 minutes each, and then we will jump into questions. So Ian, you're up first.
Hi everyone, my name's Ian Steele. I'm from Tret Farm. It's just based outside of Oswestry in North Shropshire on the border with North Wales. I'm notorious for talking about my farm. I really love everything that we do there, so it's all really exciting. However, please do let me know when we're getting close to the 10 minutes.
I will, I'll kick you.
Okay, that's Tret Farm. What we do on Tret Farm. This is a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the farm because we've only got the 10 minutes and we'd really want to talk about the Bale grazing, but just as a bit of a context, beef cattle, so heritage variety, we've got pedigree Hereford bull, British Friesian and Hereford cross cows. We also have outdoor Tamworth pigs. We've got a bakery on the farm, so we make pies, pasties, sausage rolls, quiche, all really tasty home-baked stuff. We deliver our produce, and we used to do distribution for other, or chill distribution for other small food producers. Unfortunately, since COVID, that's kind of died away, and we've been focusing much more on local and selling retail our own produce to the local area, which I think actually has been not a terrible thing. Obviously, COVID was not great for a lot of reasons, but actually that's made us refocus, so that's been good. And also we do educational projects. We run a community interest company providing horticultural projects for adults with learning difficulties, kids with behavioural issues, and local schools. I'm not going to go into this, but basically we are grounded in holism and we use permaculture principles. So that's our holistic context for people who have heard of it. And if you haven't, learn about it. Savoury Institute and 3LM are fantastic. Family herd since 1904, Hereford cattle, 40 hectares, about 35 of permanent pasture, 150 to 200 metres elevation. Last year, our rainfall was 1,200 mil, And actually, the 2 years out of the last 5 is with 1,200 mil. So the average is 966, but the previous 10 years, the average was 850. So our average is going up, and the peaks are getting higher as well. So just throw that in with regard to rainfall. It's quite interesting. And we do a little bit of fodder crop for our own homegrown pigs. We've currently got some cows. We've got fewer than we've had in the past, but not as many as we'll have in the future. Lots of reasons why, but mostly it was available forage last summer because the grass just didn't grow. And then we also had a demand for some capital for some building projects, so sold a few animals to make that happen. In the past, we were a dairy farm. I grew up there, born and raised, but I moved away because my dad's actually stopped milking in '99, but I'd already moved away, went to college, university. I never wanted to be a farmer. Growing up in the 80s and 90s on a small dairy herd, and this dairy farm in the hills, just the economics didn't stack up, and they hadn't done for a long time. The cost of production was far above what we were getting for the milk price, and so it really was hiding to nothing. I was encouraged to go into education, and then I got a job and lived in London, worked abroad, actually worked for a petrochemical company, did that for a few years, but then I know exactly right. But then I moved back because I saw the light, and I realised actually there is a way that we can do things differently. But given the context that I was given, I had a dairy farm, or the infrastructure for a dairy farm that I needed to do something differently with. But I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to actually go on that journey. Ring feed, so we started out exclusively housed for most of the winter, and even when we'd stopped milking, the processes were still the same, so we were keeping the cattle in. I moved to having a loafing area and having ring feeders with silage outside, obligatory black plastic and all the issues that go along with mucking out and scraping up and dealing with the slurry. So we started, I'm sure all of you know the issues associated with housing animals and the cost of harvesting the fodder, so I won't read it. We just know that those are issues. Over the years, we've moved from housing animals through the winter and late autumn and early spring, and what we tried to do is we tried having the loafing area, and then tried deep littering. And then we started clicking onto the idea of actually, shouldn't we be extending the grazing season, keep the animals out for as long as possible? So I moved back to the farm in 2006. And when I started going through these processes and thinking about how we could farm differently, I wasn't a member of PFLA at that time. I don't know when the PFLA actually started, but I didn't have the networks that I needed to be able to learn it from elsewhere, and so we had to make it up ourselves. And so I always say to people that we're practicing permaculture and we're practicing farming because we're still not very good at it, but we're getting better every day. And the things that we've done in the past are not the things we're doing right now, and they won't be the things we're going to do in the future. But I think with the help of the good folks in PFLA and also your help and the wider network of ecological farming, it means we can learn from each other and get it back and move better. We've essentially, all we did was we kept the cows out longer until a point where we didn't have to bring them in at all. And actually 2 years ago, we got to a point where we kept the animals out, the cows, we keep them in 2 separate herds. The cows didn't actually need any bales at all. We started out putting the bales in ring feeders, but then we've actually started moving into to unrolling them. So we split the herd into 2. I'm so sorry. So we split the herd into 2. We got the yearlings and the calves in one family group, and we got the cows and the bull in the other family group. And the cows at that point are all in calf, and so the bull's running with them. We do spring calving, so the bull's in with them for June and July, and then pulled out until they're PD tested in October, November, then back in with them, and then he's with them over the winter. So we've got 2 ridges on the farm. It's a clay bowl, very, very heavy clay, very squidgy, great for cob building, not fantastic for well, I suppose it just comes with its own challenges, doesn't it? I'm sure people will appreciate that every ground type has its limitations, but also its benefits as well. We never burn, that's one good thing, it holds the water. So water, we've got a spring-fed drinker for the cows at the top there on the Kynant, and we've got water plug-in points for nose drinkers with Plaston valves for the calves and yearlings on the big field, the imaginatively named big field. Whoever thought of that one. And then you can see a picture of the farm, a picture from the beginning of the presentation, up on the ridge on the right-hand side of the Kynant. You can actually see the cows up there, and then to the left, the big field. Just quickly, we're going to go through the yearling grazing on the big field. You can see the bales put out on the ridge. So we harvest the bales from the field, which is just over the ridge. It's a wildflower meadow. Harvest it in late August or mid to late August, and we put the bales straight out onto the ridge. So they're there all summer and autumn, or the late summer, autumn, and going into winter. And that's my plan. So I've tried using online tools for designing the bale cells and for working out the forage requirements. But really, after spending money on different apps and websites, I've gone back to the old school, just pen and paper, write it down, then I've got something physical I can compare one year to another with. It's too faint, really, to read what it is, but basically, all the information's on there, like the number of bales, the size of the field, the live weight of the stock of the animals that are on there, and therefore their daily weight requirement in dry matter. And then 3 minutes, okay, no problems. I record all that information so then I can make a better plan going forward. I do that for the different groups of animals. You can see the top picture where the bale's being put out with a double bale handler on the back of an old Ford 7610, and then the bale's being eaten by the cows, by the yearlings. Unroll it by hand, just rolls down the field, and the calves and the yearlings push the help, actually, open the bale up. They love it. Cows winter grazing, it's very, very similar, except that because on the access to the Kynant, we've got a track access. So rather than putting the bales out, we actually take the bales when they require it, because we've also got an exposed rocky ridge. So we're able to drive the tractor up onto that. We used to use a bale chopper, but actually it's more expensive in machinery and diesel and time. So actually we now just open the whole bale out for them. And it has the added benefit of, even in really, really inclement weather, in the old days when the animals were housed, we had to let them out when it was like this, because all the pipes would freeze, we'd have no water in the shed. But then we'd have problems of feeding them outside. Now it's got the added benefit, there's a natural spring feeder, which means the weather doesn't really have an impact. They've got access to water, and we can bring the bales to them. And that's it. Thank you very much indeed.
Hi, I'm Claire. I farm in the Lake District. We're Pasture for Life certified. We've got a circular herd of beef shorthorn, but we finish everything ourselves and sell everything direct. So I thought I'd start by giving you a bit of a tour of the farm and explaining how we do our annual grazing, and sort of that will explain how the bale grazing fits into that. So we've got top fell, you don't have to worry about, because that's where we just have the ponies in the summer. The big yellow band is our meadows, and that's where we have the cattle in most of the year. We're mob grazing that from April through to November. And the whole time that we're mob grazing that, our wood pasture and woodland is left to rest, with the exception of a few pigs running around. And that is essentially we call it our winter block. It's our rough grazing, and that's where the cows are November through till March. Now, you might ask why we do bale grazing. Well, go back to, it was in March 2021. The sun was probably shining. We thought, great, it's spring. Let's take the cows off the wood pasture, start them on the rotations. They were starting to complain at us a bit, which often makes us think that they want to move. Thing is, it wasn't spring. It was a false spring. We get them in Cumbria quite a lot. So we'd started grazing and we just got them on there too soon. The grass was too short, it wasn't getting away. We ended up rotating far too quickly through the meadows. So at that stage, we kind of thought, we've got to think of a early spring solution, basically. And actually last winter, we sort of thought, why were the cows complaining at us? Because that winter block is quite important for us to let the cows forage and decide where they want to go in the winter rather than doing any mob grazing. And it's an area you can't really do mob grazing. But we did some testing on the forage that wasn't being grazed throughout winter every month. And we found that the grass is actually really good quality, maintains a much higher quality than hay, all the way through the winter until March, and the quality really drops off a lot, and that was why the cows were complaining at us. So we really needed to have a solution. So that's why we thought, we'd heard of bale grazing, we thought, let's give it a go. We picked a really crap field that the cows don't really like, they hadn't really touched it, so we thought, it doesn't really matter if it goes wrong. But it worked, and we really loved it, and it's really good fun. Rolling out bales is really good fun, which we learned. So we thought, that's brilliant. Problem was that field we then put into wood pasture creation, which means we couldn't do any bale grazing on it. So we looked around the farm, thought what the options were as part of our countryside stewardship application. We picked this field, it's called Doverfield. It's another, as you can see, it's very yellow, a lot of buttercup, also not a very good field. So we thought, let's see if we can use the bale grazing to improve it, because we didn't put it into any countryside stewardship scheme, because if we wanted to put it into species-rich meadow restoration, we'd have had to do sort of ploughing up or green hay transfer, which we didn't want to do, doesn't follow in with our context at all. So we thought, well, let's see what bale grazing does, which is why this Innovative Labs project is great, because we can prove if it is working or not. So we put out, 12 acre fields, 32 head of cattle, so it was just, didn't have our calves, it was just the cows and the followers, but we'd weaned last year's. So yeah, it did us for 34 days from end of February to the end of March, and it just meant that those meadows got a chance to get ahead of themselves before we started mob grazing. And as you can see, it gets pretty wet, but you'll see this is what it looked like beforehand. Straight after, we still had a really good covering. I think it was that long rest period that we had before, and then we've left it again. We left it again, so this was it in June, and then we didn't graze that until July last year. And then again, this year, we have yet to start bale grazing. We haven't fed any hay to any of our cows yet. So this is what we're going to be going into in March. We've done something slightly different in that we've made our own hay. So last year, we worked out a bale and a half was enough for our cattle. This year, we're going to have slightly more because we've still got the calves on and our herd is growing. We've got a bale of ours, and then we found some Cumbria Wildlife Trust species-rich hay. So every day they're getting one of our bales and then one of the Cumbria Wildlife Trust bales, just to see if we can introduce some more seed into it. So the question is whether we made hay in September this year, and they did too, so it's whether there's any seed on it or not, I'm not sure, but we'll see if it works. There's no harm in trying. We didn't actually need to buy hay because we made plenty of it ourselves. The hay, in fact, was not made in this field. We have 4 fields that we make hay from, and we rotate which field that is every year, just to kind of give them a good bit of rest between them. So that's our plan. We'll start doing that end of February, early March. So I thought I'd spend a little bit about financials, but I didn't want to put them straight up there because our decision to outwinter is not a purely financial one. It's holistic, I suppose, in that we did house in up to I think 2020 was the first winter. 2019-20 was the first winter that we fully outwintered. When we were housing, we just weren't enjoying it. I mean, this is the barn that we had the cows inside. It's about as old as me. My granddad built it. It requires mucking out once a day, feeding up twice a day. It wasn't an enjoyable thing to do. And also the muck spreader needed emptying every 3 days, which come wind, rain or snow, it's not very good environmentally to do that. But also it was taking up a lot of time. So I've kind of given some really rough figures as to how much it was costing us per head to house versus how much it's costing us per head to when we're out wintering. And that really is our time. It really doesn't take very long to do the bale grazing. We're done by 10 o'clock really. But I suppose the only slight caution is our herd has increased quite a lot. But also this shed is now not big enough for our herd. So if we were to house, we'd need to be building a new shed. And if that's a capital outlay that we just didn't see any benefit of doing. But ultimately, as much as I complain about this shed, now that we've got everything outside, we've got a new shed. And we can do stuff in it. So we're doing a Johnson Soup bioreactor that we've got in the corner using a couple of cubicles. And we took a bit of influence from a farm in Peebles who had got their entire bank of cubicles there turned into a Johnson Soup bioreactor. And we also use it to salt and store hides, which we're turning into leather. So there's kind of so much opportunity now that we've got this new shed. So yeah, I mean, bale grazing for us isn't a full winter strategy. For us, it's our early spring strategy, but it is overall how we can outwinter so that we can keep everything outside all year and the cows remaining happy. All right, thank you.
Just before Ian starts, I just want to say that, there's girl math and farmer math. Bale grazing math is, I got a new shed out of bale grazing. I'm not sure how you quantified that, Claire, but fair enough. Sorry, Ian.
That's quite all right. Hang on, I just want to make sure we've actually got... I'll have that one up there. I'm Ian Horsley. I farm with my wife Rosanna at the Baston Hall estate. It's a small mixed estate in Malvern, or just north of Malvern in the Malvern Hills AOMB, or National Landscape as it's now called. We're a 140-acre farm, of which 40 acres is semi-natural ancient woodland and the rest is all pasture. The diversified side of it is we use the house as a small conference centre and holiday centre. And we're changing that at the moment, and we're relaunching as a regenerative farm stay. So please do visit. We were traditionally we've been there 6 years. In the first 4.5 years that we were there, we were 100% sheep. We came up from Devon with sheep, and at the end of 2021, we decided to make a switch out of sheep into cattle as our regenerative journey kind of moved to a point where we wanted a larger ruminant animal who could deal with the grass that we wanted to grow without having to breed our sheep up to a point where they would thrive better on being on that sort of longer grass forage system. So we bought in a herd of Aberdeen Angus, and we're currently 49 animals on farm. We've got 19 pregnant cows and followers. So we've got 17 calves at foot at the moment, a bull and sort of 10 yearlings and 2-year-olds. And a small handful of sheep, which take up more time than they should. This is the main bulk of the farm. We've got a lovely ridge in the middle with woodland on it, pasture on both sides. The field just up ahead of the farmyard was the first year's bale grazing. There was another field on the other side of the hill that's the second half of that year's bale grazing. The second year bale grazing is up at the top of the farm. I'll work through them as I go through it. We're on to our third year this winter, but I'm not going to talk about that so much in this. I'll talk about it a bit later. We designed the farming system as a sort of simple one-man system. I farm with my wife, but she runs the house, and I run the farming system. So we manage the grass and the grazing to maximise rest period during the growing season. We managed to get 73 days in our first year with cattle and 78 days average rest in the second year, just this summer just gone. The plan is basically to minimise costs over winter, because that's a big cost to the system, and to keep them in for a maximum of sort of 1 to 2 months. In the first year they were in for 2 months, but that was mainly because we went away for some time, so we extended how long they were in for. The second year they were in for about 6 weeks. This year the cows and calves will be in for, I'm not quite sure yet, probably about a month. I haven't got the straw yet, so they're not going to be in at all at this point. And that will be to help with weaning. I'll wean in the shed, and also because as we're growing, we're getting to the point where we're needing more ground, so I think it's sensible to put them in for a short period of time. The plan is all the cows have to carry a calf at foot over winter, so that we're not feeding the calf, so we wean after the winter. They do all the heavy lifting in terms of adding additional protein to that animal's ration. So the cow has to carry the calf at foot and have a calf in utero, so they're all pregnant at the moment. And to do that every winter. We're 100% pasture fed. We're not certified yet. That could be in the offing at some point, but it's a done deal anyway. That's where we are. Hang on. I'll go to so in September 21, which is just before the cattle arrived in November 21, September 21, we placed the bales in the first field. They came straight off they were made in the fields on farm. And I moved them into position in September when it was bone dry, hard, solid ground to drive the tractor on, makes absolutely no damage whatsoever, and then all I have to do is go into the field during the winter on foot, which is great, doesn't damage the fields. In that first field I did actually drive in with the quad a little bit to bolster their ration as I sort of worked through how much. I didn't do so much of the calculation. I went for a bit of a one bale, one space, and we'll see how we go. That turned out to be probably about a quarter of a bale, half a bale light at that point, so I just added a bit each day from some square bales that I had. So we had 14 cows and 10 calves in this one small field. They're very small. I think Nikki was quite shocked when she saw the size of the zones they were in. They were not large zones that they were in that particular field. I went for high impact and maximum benefit. Big fertility boost in a very tired field right next to the farmyard. Excuse me, next to the farmyard. We had 2 batches of bale grazing in the first year. Had a section in this field, 43 days, and then a section in the second field of 34 days. They was planned to be the same time, but it got to the end of March, and they weren't that interested in the hay, so I thought I'd save it, keep it as a drought pod. So I had a drought space that I could put them in to use the flexibility of the system to provide an opportunity in the summer if I wanted to rest the fields during the heat of summer, and that worked really well that first year. It's a very cheap system. With hay at £15 a bale, it cost £1.05 per day per livestock unit, whereas it costs £2.60 per day per livestock unit in the shed due to the cost of straw, mucking out, turning the compost and then getting it spread back on the fields. We had some great conditions at the start. This is so the cattle only just went into this November 21. Very exciting. Cows on the farm. And I thought this is a wonderful system. They're making very little impact. Very impressed with how it's working. Felt like I got it nicely balanced. A little less favourable in December, at which point the size of the zone starts to impact. And I started to worry that maybe we made the zones a bit too small. Luckily, I knew the second field they're going into, they're going to be much bigger sort of squares, which is good. They get really quite messy in places. I'm showing this because I want to show you what the recovery's like on this. It looks really bad. 14 months later, I mean, it didn't take that long to recover, but that's when I just happened to take the photo. Because I was already bale grazing the following year and it came up in discussion. So I went back, took some photos, I took some video, dug some holes, and the soil profile was no different in the sort of damaged area than it was outside the damaged area. There were compressions where the hoof print was, but the actual soil structure was no different. And we're on fairly sort of medium heavy. It's a sort of a clay silt loam, very high magnesium, very tight soils, desperately trying to get air and roots into the soils to make them more permeable and make them breathe and have better life in them. That's what I'm trying to do across the whole farm. That's that first field, worked their way along. You can see the 5 days of heavy rain as they came into the end of December and the start of January. They left that field at the start of January. In February, so it's 18th of February, starting to recover nicely. 8th of March. Well, I'm going to click this. There we go. 9th of May. So you can barely, it's coming back really well. That's my bokashi heap next to it. For the period they were in the shed, I obviously had to muck out, and that's the heap next to it. I've got a group of steers in this, who've just had them in this field just now, 2 years later, and the ground has held up so much better this time round. It's in really good condition, even given the rain we've had, so it's definitely had a benefit. Just a couple of closer looks. That is a field 6 months later. You can't see the damage, you can see how quickly it's bounced back, even with the heavy pounding it took. The following year, I tried we just had one big field, took the biggest field on the farm. We call it Springs. That's maybe not, that probably tells you we want to avoid that one. But we thought we'd go for it. It mainly gets wet in the bottom far end corner. So actually, again, I left that as a drought pod this year, or last winter, sorry. We had some good conditions. Having learned what we did last year, I went for a very regimented 25 by 25 metre grid. It was a bigger space. I put 2 bales in, so I could prep up one to roll down one side, one to roll down the other side to spread the sort of damage and impact. Rolling the bales out along the fence line always, so that the cattle are less inclined to lie on it, stand on it, crap on it. So they just stick their head under it like a feed barrier and enjoy a good couple of bales a day. Very similar costs to the year before. I set it up with 160 bales from 3 fields around there. Some of that was wildflower meadow hay, and I'm seeing all the wildflowers popping up already later in this summer, last summer. So that was they came out in March, and by August I was getting oxeye daisies, etc., popping up all over that field where they've never been before. So it's definitely working for spreading seed, but then we cut the hay a bit earlier, so that got away with it. It worked last year. We set it with 160 bales to get 80 days out of it. I ended up using 140 bales and getting 94 days out of it. And then they were inside for a month, which left us 20-something bales in the field for the summer drought, which we didn't need. So they actually went in and ate that in November this year, which meant that particular area of drought pod had nearly 18 months of rest, and the improvement to the soil is amazing. Soil structure with 18 months rest was definitely well worth doing, and is helping our sort of tight magnesium soils with roots only. So that's something I definitely have taken from it, is I'd like to leave a field for as long as possible at some point in the rotation, if I can. How am I for time? Similar in that field, we're great conditions in November. Really enjoying it. Bale grazing's a delight. It really is a delight until this week. I questioned myself a lot this week. End of December, lovely grass that they said, a really good bit of fresh bite. That hadn't been grazed since the bales were actually made in that field. So there wasn't that much regrowth. It was a terrible year for regrowth last year. March snows were a little bit more challenging. They went into the shed in the middle, so they had a section in December, early January, went into the shed, we went on holiday, they came out and went back out in March. That felt like it was okay. I was meant to be doing a presentation for the AOMB that day. They cancelled. I don't know why. Lovely conditions. The next day was not so much fun when it all melted. It looked disgusting, and again you start worrying about damage and soil destruction and all the rest of it. But it's bounced back pretty well. So I left the odd bale. The flexibility is leaving a couple of bales behind on the left-hand side. If it is too wet and you want to move them on, just move them on. Leave the bale behind. Doesn't matter. Pick it up later. Use it in the summer. Try not to be too rigid to the system. It grew back very nicely in June. I think it's this year I'm going to really see the benefit. I think it's me. And I'm hoping to see an improvement in species in the pasture. Hopefully it is reset. It's opened up the seed bank and reset what was a fairly tired pasture. It had also been cut for hay a lot by us and by the previous owner. So it was very tired. It needed this big fertility boost. So I'm hoping that's been provided by this system. We grazed it, so it had the best part of 260 days rest across that zone and was grazed in September this year. So they came out in March, but the bit that they first grazed had such a long period of rest. So you can see the regrowth. It was really good that they went into nice long grass, give a quick mob graze through there, move them through. But there's definitely room for improvement and learning. You can see a little bit of these are the zones that got more heavily poached. They're still coming back. They came back, but they came back more slowly. Now, you can't really tell. And what you can see is I sprinkled a bit of red clover, so you can see a little bit of red clover on those patches as well. So you can use that as an opportunity to add seed onto disturbed soil, I think. And then this is a little drought pod, which they went into in November, which is the bit they didn't graze that year. It gave us a really good start to this winter's grazing before the cows went off farm to a different site for a slightly different approach this winter. And even the RPA's caught us. So I'm expecting to see 80 different field parcels pop up on my plan next year. But it does give me, it's not on Google, it's not on Apple, it's not on anything else, but the RPA's got it. So it's quite nice to have the aerial photo. And I feel like quite a nice even grid pattern there. I paced it out quite well, I think. There we go, that's me.
I've got one of these, hope it works. Yes. Hi, buckle up, 10 minutes, that's short for me. So, I'm Teddy Lawrence, I manage Fai Farms, which is right on the edge of Oxford. So, it's 570 hectares. Over about 110 hectares of that is what you'll see when you guys go home and you drive down the A34 or the A40, and it looks like a lake today, and it's all underwater. So my farm, about 60% of that will go underwater. It's probably round about there now. Outwinter, never work on that farm, they said. We showed them. It does. But we've obviously got a little bit of the farm that doesn't go underwater. The whole farm is still medium heavy clay. So in theory, it should still be quite wet. We don't get as much rainfall, we'll say, where Claire and Nikki are. It's probably, 25 inches, probably more than that this year. But where we do outwinter in our parkland, it's in a valley. And in that valley, again, medium heavy clay, there's lots of springs popping up and ditches that all the water from the woods on the top all comes down to that. So even where we outwinter, it gets very wet and there's permanent water there. So I'll give you an insight into how we've made this work. Just a quick bit more background on Fai. Fai, if you guys don't know, is a research farm working with kind of supply chain people. So we've done a deep dive into the farm's transition into AMP grazing over the last 4 years. And the outwintering, the Bale Grazing was kind of a big part of that from the start. So we're 4 years into our outwintering system. And this is a great opportunity to do a deeper dive into that specific part. So why do you want to outwinter livestock? Nikki touched on some of these already. You obviously got your cost savings. For us, we ran the figures from 2021. And we went from £2.43 per head per day from when we were housing them. 5 years ago, a bit more than that, 5 or 6 years ago, everything was set stocked. Everything was grain finished, creep fed. The sheds were full of sheep and cattle all winter. It's very different now. So we've gone from about £2.43 per head per day to £1.06 for a cow and calf pair and 91 pence for a dry animal, i.e. heifer or steer. That's on 2021. So those figures were done pre all the big farm ag inflation. Those figures also only took a snapshot of the 180-day housing period. That's the average housing period in the UK. Those figures didn't take into account all the costs and the time and the diesel, the carbon, etc., with mucking out those sheds and then going to spread that muck a year later as well as all the benefits, the cost benefits of those cows trampling in that hay and that seed. That wasn't accounted for in those figures. It's still a massive cost saving, right? So when we talk about the water infrastructure later, what we spent to make it work in this park, the we saved about it was about £26,000 saving in that first winter. When we look at this water system we put in, that cost us about 7,500. So what we spent to make it work, we already paid it back on the cost saving within the first third of the winter. Gives you more flexibility. I've always got a plan A, obviously. I like to have a plan B, a C, and even a D. So, if it was like Noah's Ark biblical, I would put them back in the shed. What it also has done is now that we've got empty sheds, there's flexibility to do other things. Or have you got options to even increase your stocking rate in the winter? Because if we can carry our animals outside, even though half the farm is underwater, we bought in a load of dairy store cattle last winter that had to go inside, so we had to transition them off their old diet. We wouldn't have been able to do that if they were all the suckler herd were in the sheds by default. We've got soil health benefits. For me, I always think whatever we're doing, whatever day of the year, whatever season, it's all around our ecosystem processes, right? So whether that's winter or summer, growing season or dormant season, how do we get as much carbon, water, minerals, and airflow through our system? It's obviously feeding your soil microbiology. And when all of those things get better, you see an increase in biodiversity, both below ground and above ground. Now, it's quite easy to think of that in the summer, right? Aim of the game, grow as much grass as possible, to photosynthesize as much as possible. What do you do for your ecosystem processes in the winter? When stuff isn't growing, stuff's not photosynthesizing. So I think about it differently. I don't worry about trampling pasture from like April until November. I just want as much photosynthesis. So my cells are much bigger. My utilization rates from the past had changed. Spring, summer, autumn, winter. Utilization rate is basically how much those animals are going to eat. Because all this game is quite simple. It's matching demand to supply. And with a few little nuances, by like thinking about your utilization rate, how much do you want to leave behind to drive your ecosystem processes, i.e. the more solar panel you leave behind the cows ungrazed, the more you can photosynthesize. If you graze it all down to the ground, you slow down your recovery. So you've got to balance your recovery and your utilization rates to maximize that. And thinking about, why I'm talking about the summer is because the whole planning around outwintering starts in the spring. Not just the maths. I've done the spreadsheet, I've done the calculations in May. If I'm lazy, maybe I've done it by June, but definitely before we cut the hay in July. Also, managing the parts of your farm you're going to outwinter on, you're going to want to manage them differently from April all the way through until November. So, for me, I know that I have to outwinter on just one part of the farm or two parts of the farm because they're the only bits that won't go underwater. That's my context, and I'd move it around. Each year it'd be somewhere different. But what I do is I make sure I graze it once in the summer, end of June, July. It looks like a wildflower meadow. And then I leave it. So I want to stockpile as much there to leave from August until November, because your stockpile and that thick, dense thatch under hoof is what gets you through these really wet days. I'm pretty sure I've got a picture in here of a wet day and what it looked like after, and you've still got ground cover. And I always run the maths on this, right? I'm not planning to go in and graze all of the pasture and all of the hay. Utilization rate, yeah? I think I generally plan on the maths to leave about 25% of what I think is going to be there on offer behind, because that's what's covering your soil, right? One of the principles of regen, keep your soil covered. So I always run the maths on this every year. You match the feed demand of the group to the feed that should be in your cells, and then you know how many bales you need, while still factoring in a buffer that you know you're going to leave a certain amount behind. Right, and all of that, when it all works, hopefully, you see an increase in biodiversity above ground. So we've seen amazingly fast changes in the plant species in our parkland. We've seen that across the whole farm over the last 4 years, but where we've monitored things in the parkland, we've also done the Allen Savory Ecological Outcome Verification Certification thing since the first year. So we've got those guys coming in, putting a kind of a neutral third-party ecological eye and assessment certification on what we're doing. Generally, the fields that are monitored in the park seem to have improved faster than the rest of the farm. So we can probably attribute a lot of that to the Bale Grazing in the winter, because obviously we're trampling in the hay, which is carbon. And when we've got high utilization rate in the winter, because we're going to eat more, because I want to maximize days grazing in the winter, they're trampling in that stockpiled brown mature pasture. It's richer in carbon, right? The browner it is, the higher the carbon ratio to nitrogen. Spring, it's more the other way around, nitrogen to carbon, greener. So that's what I think about. In the winter, I'm going to trample that in, stocking density gets higher, maximize days grazing without grazing it all to the floor. And that's essentially, I've not put real numbers in here because I thought I'll scribble them down and then they'll go and use them on their farm. This is so key, right? You've got to understand your own, each individual group's feed requirements, what's in your pasture on offer. But that's basically how I make it work. In June, I'll be like, right, what group of animals are coming up to this block? All right, so say it's 100 cows with 100 calves. And I find out the average weight of each cow and calf pair, and I times it by 100. And then I understand what their daily feed requirement is in kilos of dry matter per day. Guess what? Kilos of dry matter also is what's in the pasture when you do the maths on that. So actually these figures all line up, and that's what you do. That's what I do spring, summer, autumn, winter. And I'm like, right, well, if I don't go in from August, I'm going to go in on the 1st of November, because that's a pretty safe bet. I can get to the 1st of November without the farm going underwater. But from the 1st of November onwards, it could be underwater, really wet. So I always plan to go there, and if I can stay on the floodplain later, like I did last winter when it was dry, I will, and I'll keep days in the bank as like a safety net. But I always plan to go 1st November to the end of April. So I know that I want to get 170, 180 days grazing out of the 85 hectares that I can outwinter on, or at least in that block. There's another block we are doing it on now as well. So if I've got 85 hectares and I want 180 days, I need to do half hectare cells. So I've figured that out, right? That'll do 1 day in each cell, 1/2 hectare each day. Does 100 cows or calves fit in half a hectare without it being like shoulder to shoulder? Yes, it does. It sounds like it wouldn't, but actually they do, and it's quite a lot of space. But if you didn't have bales in there, they would eat everything down to the ground by late morning and be hungry and push your fences over. So then you understand how many hay bales you need to put in to that cell, where that feed deficit is, which is what this calculation is there, basically. And then you know how many hay bales you need in each cell. Then when we make the hay in the summer, they go straight from the hay meadows that are now underwater, and they go into the park, and they're placed out ready. So this year we didn't make hay until the first week of September. It's pretty stressful. It was like our last chance saloon. If we didn't do it then, we wouldn't have done it, and it would have been a disaster. But normally we get it done mid-July. We have a cutting date, because it's all triple SI. So usually by the end of August, early September, all the hay is moved and placed. I don't have to think about winter anymore until I literally put the fences up before I move the cows in. It's quite a nice feeling, really. You've already got your feed already there, ready to go. And all you've got to do every day is go and push it out, and that's it. Move your fence. You can do it in like half an hour if you're quick, if you're in a rush. So that's kind of, it's a bit of a fuzzy picture, but that's kind of what the cell looks like in the morning before I move the cows in. See the quad at the top? I've driven into the cell, unroll the bales. We've got 160 head in half a hectare in this picture with 5 hay bales. And then when I've done all of that and I've picked up the nettings, I hate plastics, I always do that. By the way, don't wrap the bales, it's just normal hay netting, right? And obviously leave your bales netting side skywards, because then when it rains, it doesn't go into the bale and it doesn't rot from the inside out. And then we move the cows in and we move the water with them as well. So there's always a back fence. I love a back fence because they can't go back where they came from. And all you're doing in a grazing situation is controlling 3 things: grazing, animal impact, and time. Can't control the weather, can't control feed for fuel, blah, blah, blah. Don't worry about it. Plan and get good at what you can control. So, time. How long are they in the same place for, or how long until they come around again? Overgrazing is that. It's just a factor of time. They've either stayed in the same place too long, or they've come back around again too quick. So in the winter, when it's wet on heavy clay, you want to hit them in one little short, sharp burst on that patch and don't let them go back there. The only time I break that rule is when it freezes. So I'll touch on that in a minute, what we do when it freezes, but generally I've always got 4 squares, 4 sides around my cows. It's like a giant chessboard. They move into 1 square each day, and they don't go back again until they graze it again in June or July. But you can't see it then. It doesn't look like if you went up there now, you can see the squares, like a huge 85 hectare chessboard. Some of you guys have been to my place a few times. You've probably seen it summer and winter. You go in like May, everything is just green. There's no, even the cells that were really wet and got muddier, they all bounce back and it all goes really uniform. Other things to consider, you've got to choose the right ground, right? You guys know the best parts of your farm. For me, it was easy. It's like, well, that won't go underwater, even though it's wet. So, as I said, you've got to manage your pasture for outwintering across the whole season. Don't go in November, oh, let's try and outwinter in that field we grazed last month. Could maybe make it work, but you've got to get all the bales out there, make a mess. You've probably not built up the thatchy cover underneath your feet, because permanent pasture is king, right? If you're doing this on herbal lays, yeah, maybe you can make it work. We are doing it on herbal lays with a different group. But permanent pasture, you get that really dense, thick thatch, right? That's the structure underneath that stops it getting too poached too quick. I think about infrastructure, so fencing water. I mentioned what we paid to get it in is a big ring fence, big ring main of water there. So we mole ploughed that in underground so it doesn't freeze. Every 150 meters is a tap that comes out of ground. So when it freezes, I've only got to defrost that tap, and we keep loads of spare pipe up there facing uphill. So when it defrosts, we've always got a bit of pipe that isn't frozen. What I also do, if I get told off being too quick, is we've got like a 3 or 4 tier frost mitigation plan. So I've got all these springs, right? Guess what I've done? I've chucked bathtubs under them. I've chucked old troughs under them. So there's a constant running flow of water in some fields. I've also got a big bulk tank, which I'll set up before it freezes, and I'll drop the back fences, because when it's frozen hard, the animal impact doesn't matter, because the ground's so hard, they don't break down the surface. They can keep going backwards and forwards for a week if they need to. This is how I plan the cells. So that's the park in the bottom where all those red lines are. So I've kind of done the maths on this in early summer. So when we get the hay out the hay meadows, there's the whole farm. You can see us in Oxford, like right there. Bottom left, that's all the yellow stuff, that's the hay meadows. So straight out on there, we know that in each one of those squares, we're going to put 5 bales. Put them the right way around. Because if you unroll the bale when it's the wrong way, it's really bloody hard work, and I don't like hard work. And it's worth spending the time in the summer making sure they're the right way, so when you push it down the hill, it all unrolls. So think about that. And it's easy. So guys can see this on their phone when they're placing the bales out, right? You've got a little phone holder in the loader, in the tractor. You can see your little blue dot, so you know exactly where you are and where you need to put your bales. Makes life easy. It's not perfect because they're not perfectly drawn. And I've gone over 2 minutes. That's basically what it looks like. So there's an aerial view of the outwintering. This was from like 4 years ago before we kind of scaled it up. It's kind of bigger and flasher now, more cows, more hay. On the left is what that exact bit of the park looks like in the summer. It's like a triple SI flower meadow to me. It's like every colour under sun, full of bugs and insects. And that is naturally seeding. So whatever comes up in the hay, that's getting trampled in. But actually, I think the main driver is the animal impact, and them being equally dense and in the same half-hectare cell on every single patch of that ground for 24 hours. It's a hoof print every few square inches. And all that seed from the summer, whether it's in the hay or in the pasture, gets trampled in. So you can change this and improve your farm and use it as a tool, basically. It can be a cost-saving thing. It gives you more flexibility, but you can also use it as a tool to regenerate and increase biodiversity and bring in more wildlife and birds and insects over time. Sorry. I think that's me done.
Brilliant, thank you. Amazing. Thank you so much, all 4 of you. So we're going to go to questions, and we will be also picking up questions from the online option as well. Just while you're having a little think about what your questions might be, there's just a couple of things I guess I just want to round up from the comments that have been made through the presentations. And I think it's really interesting that the cost-saving bit really is stark. And I was just doing a little bit of maths to work out that I think, Silas, that year that you put in 21-22 was like a £27,000 saving in 1 year, from 43k to 16k just for your feeding then versus your feeding and housing. So in 1 year, essentially enough to potentially contribute to the bulk of a salary, maybe. So there's options, by shifting these systems, not only in terms of saving money, but also maybe being able to create opportunity for other people to come into the business if it does make financial sense. We're also Bale Grazing at home, and our feed costs per head last year, over 180 days, were 36 pence per head per day, and the Scottish average is £2.66 just in feed, not in bedding or housing. So huge cost savings potential with this. As I mentioned earlier, we have been working with Emily Grant and Ridian Jones, who are two consultants working for AHDB, who've been doing a cost-benefit analysis. What they've identified, although it is difficult to do before and after, because some of us have never housed, and so actually you can't really do a pre and post system change. But what's very clear is that there are massive savings, particularly around labour. And I know that one of the challenges with a lot of particularly family farms, there's a lot of free labour built in there, so it can be difficult to quantify, but actually a reduction in labour, which corresponds to an increase in farmer well-being, which, as I'm sure we all appreciate, is really important. So there's some really nice kind of themes that are coming through. And I think the other theme that was really coming through in this was about flexibility. So Ian, you were saying about maybe feed that bale, don't feed that bale. Maybe just let them have the grass, they don't need the grass. It just sort of depends on the weather and the flexibility that you mentioned as well, Silas, about if it is solid ground because of freezing, you can let them go back, and options for water. I'm sure there'll be questions about, give us the detail on how you manage water in these systems. And I thought it was really great, all of you talked about like planning well ahead in advance, you know, like winter 24-25 is probably all in our minds already. You know, we're thinking about what's working now, what we want to change for next year. So it very much is about the long game, and often follows as a result of folk who are doing mob grazing, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, holistic plan grazing. This isn't really something you can go, I would say, from like set stocked and housing. It's very difficult to go from that just straight into sort of bale grazing or deferred grazing. It seems to be generally a kind of a journey, a path, and you kind of develop your confidence as you go. So Andy, have we got any questions online?
So first question from online is, to those that leave the unwrapped bales in the field before using them, is there much loss from rain, etc.?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Do you want to take that one, Ian?
Yeah. No, not really. There's not a great deal of loss. There's about, obviously it works like a thatch roof. So the water, as long as you have it that way round and not tin can, it will rot out the centre, but if you have it sitting like that, then you'll get a little bit of loss on the top, which is almost like a hard crust, maybe maximum of an inch. That peels off quite easily. The bottom, where it's in contact with the soil, obviously it could be quite a bit wetter down there, so you might have a couple of inches. For example, that stuff that I left out for 18 months that they grazed this November had been there since July the previous year. That had maybe 3.5 inches of damage at the bottom that was wasted. It just gets trampled straight into the ground and feeds the soil, so it's never really wasted. It's just added back to the system. No, not a great deal of wastage. I've been very impressed with how it works, actually, in that respect.
Claire, do you want to add to that? You have like probably 2 metres of rain this year, I'd imagine, where you are.
Yeah, no, it's quite wet, but actually it's quite similar. I think we, in our calculation, assume about 10% loss, but I don't think it is that much. I think that's just quite a conservative calculation. I think on Ian's point about leaving it on the ground, I'd rather leaving that than black plastic. I kind of view it as that bit that you lose is what replaces the black plastic.
Point. Just for an example, we've just started feeding our bales out for the first time. So 1st of January is our first bale fed out this winter. We've had 690 mil of rain since the bales were put out in September, and they were baled loose by a contractor. I was very nervous because they were very loose. We rolled them out and I was amazed at the quality of the hay inside. I really was worried. I thought, right, this is probably half our hay bales will be knackered the whole way through. They weren't. They were absolutely fine, and the whole lot got cleared up with a tiny amount of waste again. So, yeah, it's kind of just see it to believe it, right? Any questions in the room, and then we'll maybe come back. I think there's a gent in the middle with a beige jacket. This is fun, trying to describe what people look like to identify who's answering the question.
Thank you very much. We're trying bale grazing for the first time this winter with a very small herd. We haven't had cattle for quite a while, mainly for conservation grazing, but we've got a lot of land under grass now. We've only got 10 just to give it a try, and finding that if you half roll out a bale, they do the rest, and then they eat, well, they eat some, but because there's so few of them, they're not eating it very fast and then trampling it in. Is there a solution to that you can propose? And is there a sort of optimal size of, how do you put it, a group of cattle that, or minimum size that works for bale grazing?
Ian, you've got like smaller groups. Do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, so again, I think it's actually, a couple of things occurred to me. The first thing is, you can adjust where the fence line goes. So, like I think it was Ian earlier on, you put the fence line down the middle of the bale, you roll it, and then adjust the fence line so that it's underneath the fence, so they're eating it as if it was a creep barrier. But then I was thinking back to a conversation we had online last winter when we were comparing losses, and it really was about thinking about changing that mindset and thinking, well, is it a loss, is it waste, or are we feeding the soil? And actually, because the regrowth from the areas where there is some material that's been left behind, that's been trampled and slept on and shat on, actually the regrowth is phenomenal, it's really fantastic, and we're getting an extra bite out of it the next year. So really, that's almost like a deferred grazing plan. So it might be a part of reframing that image of what is waste and actually allowing them to exhibit their natural behaviours and lying in some warm hay in the winter. Maybe that's not the worst thing in the world.
Claire, you've also taken like hay off a bale and like taken it up separately to a small group as well, haven't you, to kind of manage?
No, we haven't. I think last year it was bale and a half, so we had one bale and then we were just driving out in the back of a quad bike a load of loose hay. But yeah, don't need to do that this year.
Okay. Ian?
With the half bale, are you rolling it out the half bale and then hoping that they wouldn't eat the other bale as it's sitting there? Yeah, but you don't want them to, or they do? They do the work for you? Right, what I've done in the past when I only want them to have half the bale is to roll out that half and then just put the other half on the other side of the electric fence and then roll it back the following day or roll it into the next zone, whatever. You just roll it out and then stop them, and it keeps them off it, the same as it keeps them off any other bale in the field. Well, and you can always turn the bale round, and then when you roll it the other way, it doesn't unwind, so then you can roll it a bit further away. It'd be easy with the half bale because there's not much weight to that then.
Okay, should we go to another question online? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so this question is interested in why some are back fencing and some are not back fencing. What do the panel see as the advantages and disadvantages of back fencing?
Silas, you're a fan of a back fence.
I love a back fence, as I alluded to it. So it's the animal impact thing. So deep poaching, i.e. imagine what some people, when they think about wintering, they imagine cows around a ring feeder up to their bellies in mud. That is too much animal impact. They've stayed in the same place too long. So if I didn't have my back fences up this week with all this constant rain, they would constantly be going back, walking over the cells they've already grazed that are now got much less structure above the soil because they've grazed it off. So even now we're getting these incredibly wet days, they're just in one cell for 24 hours. So, you know, I'm not worried that we've not got enough cover there because I've factored that into my planning. So the back fence is crucial, particularly on wet days. When it freezes and the ground's hard, I do drop the back fences and I put up a much bigger trough of water above a tap. So I've got more water there that won't freeze. So again, it's flexibility and adaptability. I like to be very proactive in the planning, but an element of being reactive on the ground depending on what the weather's doing. Some people don't use them, but when it's wet, I think they're worth it.
Oh, I don't need it that way. I am a little bit more relaxed about back grazing, but I think it's typically because of the topography of my farm. You're on a floodplain basically, or some gentle sloping fields, whereas I'm on substantially more incline. So my paddocks I put out for 3 days at a time because walking up and down that hill, it's time consuming. It's good fun, it's good exercise, but it's time consuming. And also with regard to water, we've got a natural spring-fed drinker for the cows, and it's a breeze block structure surrounded by hardcore and gravel, and so they're not having the detrimental impact on the exact space around the drinker. And because it's relatively in the centre of the field, it's not tucked away, they're not approaching it from one direction, and so the animal impact is relatively less than it otherwise could be. Through winter as well, you're not going to get as much regrowth, and we try to move our cattle off the winter grazing as quickly as possible, well, the cows especially beginning of March, because they're going to calve, and I don't want them calving on the winter grazing. And so it's getting plenty of rest until next time. So I'm not too fussed about the back grazing. over winter.
I would say as well, so Stuart Mitchell, who's another one of our Bale Grazing Field Lab farmers, so I think it's 120 cows they have on a hill just outside Hoyk in the Scottish borders, and they don't use a back fence at all. And again, it's all context specific. So it's really exposed. I've been on that hill on like the second day of March, and it was just like horrendous. It was so exposed. But the reason they don't use a back fence is because the cows start on one side of the hill and they move their way across the hill. But where they start is where there's a big copse of trees, and so there's lots of shelter. So they make sure that they don't use a back fence so that the cattle can always come back to the trees, so they've always got some shelter. That hill is only ever grazed during the winter, so it gets a whole year rest, and then they bring them back onto it. So again, it's so context specific, it's topographically specific, it's water point specific. What I would say is that it's about you being very clear on what the challenges are or are likely to be in your context, and then being able to create mitigation, multiple different mitigation strategies around them, taking into account animal welfare, soil health, water access, etc. So it's really, really complex, but you can have these guiding principles, as Silas very eloquently talked through, in terms of the ecosystem processes and trying to align your practice with those principles. Another question. Oh, sorry.
Just to add to that, we're quite similar to Stuart.
Yeah.
But we actually find that it's, again, in strips, we don't back fence, but they actually don't go back very often. They tend to stay where there's the fresh bale and the fresh grass. They will only really go back if it's extreme, and they go back to the trees.
Brilliant. Okay, we've got a question just here. Keep your hand up so the microphone person can find you. Thank you.
Yeah, that all sounds really, really positive. I was just wondering, just to be the cynic, what has been the biggest challenges that you've encountered, and what is there any particular part of your systems that you might change going forward?
Yeah. Go on, each of you can give a challenge. Do you want to start, Silas? We'll start that and then work our way back.
I think, so this predated me, so I've been at this one for 3 years. I know the thing that they went back to the drawing board over and was right, we need to change this, was that they tried to do it similarly before investing in the water infrastructure. So, you know, as Nicky said, context specific. With us being with a big herd with a big block, we need to really we wanted to be able to move the water around with the cows. That wasn't able to happen when the first year they tried this. So that created a lot of traffic and a lot of mess. You know, with us, bottom of the valley, it's so wet, you don't want them moving back, but that's, you know, us heavy clay, wet farm. So when that was a big learning, they did actually bring them into the sheds partway through the winter, pulled the plug on it, and then put the water in the summer, and then it worked.
Ian?
Biggest challenge, probably, you saw some of it, a little bit making the cells too small in the first year. And that particular bit that got very damaged was next to the woodland, so there wasn't a great deal of grass there anyway because of the trees, big ash trees sort of shade it out, so it's quite thin on grazing in that area anyway, so it poached up very quickly. So yeah, wet ground, getting too wet too quickly, and then being too rigid, rather than saying they're damaging this, I can see the weather forecast, move them on. You know, move them twice a day, move them 3 times a day. If you've got the time and you can do it and you've got the space, you can always come back. As Silas says, you can come back when it's frozen, you can get back to areas. So being flexible is the best solution to most of the major problems, I think.
Ours might have 2. First have been probably just not knowing what to do when we started. There's definitely a bit of trial and error to getting it right and figuring out what works for us. Even though we only do the bale grazing in March, we've still had frozen pipes, because the rest of the winter, we're not worried about pipes and troughs. So this is the only month where we need to be worrying about frozen pipes going up to the trough. And we have had a pipe freeze and dump our entire 10,000 litre tank onto the field. Remarkably, it didn't actually have that much of an impact. So yeah, those are probably one of our biggest issues.
Thinking through the things you guys came up with, it made me think, actually, I haven't come across those sorts of issues. I think partly because I didn't come to bale grazing with a fixed idea of, I want to try bale grazing, because I'd never heard of it. I didn't know anything about it when I first started it 10 years ago or so. All I was doing was trying to increase the grazing season. in the autumn, and then get out from the sheds as quickly as possible in the spring. And so the learning process was relatively easy, because I took ages over it, and it's been a long journey to get to the point where they're out all the way through. So there wasn't any massive in particular problems. It was just, oh, that kind of worked, we'll do that a little bit more next year. But one thing I did realise, and I have changed this year, is I've noticed that we wean the cows and calves mid-December, and they actually come in the shed for 10 days, and I have a calf creep gate, and I feed the calves and the cows straw, wheat straw, and I feed the calves hay. And after 10 days, they've got nose rings. After 10 days, they separate themselves, and then I kick the cows out onto the winter grazing, and the calves onto their winter grazing with the yearlings, and they're quiet and happy without any problems. But I've noticed over the last couple of years the reduced growth rate of the calves with the yearlings, and I think it's just being out on the hill, in the cold, in the wet, fighting for those extra nutrients, and fighting to keep warm. And there is going to be a change in dynamic because they're away from their mothers. So this year we're actually thinking about keeping the calves in for the coldest part of the year and not putting them out with the yearlings. But maybe in going forward we'll actually keep the calves with the cows longer, like Ian does, and actually but then in the past we've seen that the cows will go down and get very thin if they're losing condition over winter, which now they don't at all when they've been weaned. So it's a bit of a work in progress.
I'm just going to also very briefly talk about water freezing long term. So I'm based in Aberdeenshire, and as I said, although I'm coordinating this, we're also Bale Grazing. So we have periods of time where we are under 0 degrees for a lot of the time. So just a nod to those of you that may well be in the north of Scotland as well. Continuous flow troughs have been a complete game changer for us. So we either create continuous flow troughs using natural spring water, so we're not on any mains water at all. So we're able to do that without there being any cost association. And also because the amount that we're abstracting is so little, and it also is flowing back into the burn or into the water source, it's not an issue. The other thing that we are doing is we've just invested in some big 1,000 litre troughs that I can move on my own, so they're quite lightweight plastic. Once they're full of water, there's no risk of them moving because it's essentially got a ton of water sitting in there, and using those to fill them up every couple of days, and then disconnecting the pipes on a hill so that they run out and they're dry, and then reconnecting and moving that water tank or that water trough, refilling. It lasts a couple of days. So in terms of the amount of time it takes, these guys were saying, it's half an hour for 5 bales to be rolled out and animals to be moved. The rest of us, it's probably less than that, 10-15 minutes really to move animals. You tend to just stand and watch them for quite a while. So that's where the time goes. But instead of, we're not having to muck out sheds, we're not having to kind of drive feed about. So the extra time it takes to disconnect some pipes or fill up some troughs really is minimal in comparison to kind of a house system. Are there any other questions? We've got quite a few over this side. So we'll go with Grey jumper. Give us a wave so we can work out who you are. Thank you.
Hello. I was wondering, what do you all think is the ideal stocking rate for the whole farm where you are outwintering and producing your own forage? So, yeah, the whole platform.
I'm going to say altogether, it depends. So there is no answer, but I don't know if any of you want to try and answer that question.
Well, I went to the session yesterday about what was the optimal level of livestock
carrying capacity.
Carrying capacity, and they didn't have an answer. So and they're better at it than I am, so I don't know. It's just keep increasing until then you've got too much, not enough fodder.
Yeah. Is there anything that FAI have been doing looking at this? I mean, your amount of animals that you can hold has been going up, right, because of the changes to your system.
So over the last 4 years, we've grown a lot more pasture. So we've been trying to increase stocking rate as much as we can, but we've been down with TB the whole time. So we've not been able to buy in animals, and we've been annoyingly losing, more females than kind of lets us get to that carrying capacity that we would like to be at. We're about 0.5 of graven livestock unit a hectare. But that's largely dictated by what can we carry in the winter. Because if my farm more than halves in the winter, then you've got less options, right? So again, it's context specific, it depends. Again, like if you were in a mega drought like last year, should maybe you just destock and decrease your short-term carrying capacity to meet the feed to supply demand? So I think it's a case of figuring out in an ideal world, in a perfect year, what is the maximum you could carry? You might find that will change as your farm gets more productive, but we never really get an ideal world. You probably have to be a little bit flexible within that where you can.
Yeah, I think there is something about just the variability of this and the flexibility. And actually a question I'm going to ask, I'm going to take Chair's prerogative here, is around increasing rainfall and the impact that that is having on stocking density as opposed to stocking rate. So stocking density being the amount of animals as per in a paddock per day, if you like, as opposed to the overall stocking rate, and whether you found the increased rainfall has had an impact on stocking density. Have you had to change the size of your paddocks? Are you moving more frequently? Like, what have the responses been? Because that then has a knock-on impact potentially to that broader stocking rate long term. Have any of you kind of found that's been particularly challenging this year?
Yeah, for us, it's more in the summer when we get rain throughout the year. So if it is a really wet period of time and you're having more impact, you just move things more quickly and then you catch up later on to slow down.
I'd agree. It's not about the stocking density, it's about the frequency of the moves and the time that they spend on that amount of ground.
Any thoughts for you guys?
We're still building numbers in our herd. I guess in our stocking density, we're trying to get to a point where it stretches, and then we'll probably pull it back a little bit, so it'll be bend until break, and then we'll try and fix the system. We haven't reached that point yet. There is a bit of a pinch. We don't have half the farm flooding, but we do have 10% of the farm in GS4 herbal lays. We've got another 10-15% in GS2. Both of those you can't bale graze on, really. I wouldn't like to try it on the herbal lay. There just isn't the sward structure. So I'm restricted on which fields I can do it on, and I'm using 3 of them. I'm back to 1 of them this year. So that winter position will limit how much we can do. Our holding capacity is also limited by, we've only really got the 1 shed set up at this point, so without more capital infrastructure spend, if we do want to house for a period, we'll have to spend some more money. We'll keep pushing a little bit and see where we get to. Hasn't been an issue in the summer. I always, at the moment, still feel understocked, and I love it.
Excellent. I think just also want to make a comment about stocking rate kind of being vague, kind of to some extent irrelevant, when actually probably what we want to be thinking is about maybe like profit per hectare as opposed to like numbers of animals per hectare. I think that's going to be far more important, particularly for those of you in England with the loss of BPS. We're safeguarded in Scotland to some extent. We're maintaining guaranteed 50%, and then the rest of it becomes conditional. But really, I think the thing is to be looking at your finances and to work out, it kind of doesn't really matter how many animals you can hold if it costs you more to keep them than you get for them. So it's definitely about identifying what that sweet spot is in terms of the finances. Any more questions online, Andy? And then we will come to the lady who just waved there in the corner. In the aisle.
Yeah, so if currently stewardship schemes don't accept bale grazing, do you think this will be something that will be included in stewardship and other farm assurances in the future?
Yeah, do you want to pick up on that one, Silas?
So that's not actually true. Where we are bale grazing, it is in park and restoration and wood pasture, which doesn't allow supplementary feeding. But you would be quite surprised to know how flexible these things are if you talk to your natural England advisor and if you get them round and really explain what you're doing. And when they realise the way that you're doing it is achieving the outcome they want, which is basically to increase soil health and biodiversity, with us what they did, they wrote this kind of management clause, a pasture management document, if you like, that partnered our application to DEFRA. So we went for the park and restoration, which is kind of what the block I was talking about earlier. Now, I've got 800 hay bales placed out on that park. It's quite a bit of supplementary feeding because we're rolling out the bale. They're not in a ring feeder, and we're moving them, obviously. And all this was laid out from Natural England in our plan. DEFRA ticked it off. So we've been able to have the stewardship on our bale grazing platform just by having the conversation with the right people.
So we had that conversation, and they still wouldn't let us. We had the wood pasture North of England expert come and see what we were doing, but still wouldn't let us do bale grazing on wood pasture creation, which is why we've got 3 fields which we chose not to put into any of our countryside stewardship, so that we could be a bit more flexible about what we did. But we've now put those fields into SFI low input grassland because you can do bale grazing on those ones.
I would just reiterate that other Pasture for Life certified member farms have found, again, like you were saying, that conversation with their local Natural England advisor has really helped as part of that. We work very closely with colleagues from Plant Life and other groups who are involved in species-rich grassland restoration, who are starting to better understand and support this kind of approach. There's always been support for kind of the spreading of green hay, but actually why waste potentially, you might want to think, why waste the spreading of green hay when you can feed it as conserved forage and still get benefit from seed spreading? And the more that we try and quantify this stuff, and that's why these field labs are really important, so that we can have case studies and we can have examples that we can then share. So it might be that in the future, when we've got more collected evidence, that could accompany that application, as you were saying, Claire, and in the future that might change. So, and just to make a nod again to devolved nations within Scotland, there's quite a lot of work within the Tier 2 measures, which is the second half of your BPS, as it were, that there was within the grassland option. It initially just said no supplementary feeding. That has been edited to reflect potential bale grazing, as long as it's sensitive to the landscape, or some words to that effect. So I think there is a shift happening from policymakers to understand this. There was a question just in the middle, and while that's happening, was there something else anyone wanted to add? Ian?
Yeah, I had a similar conversation with our Natural England, and on the GS2 ground, they wouldn't let us bale graze. So we took one of the fields out. That field, the first field we used, chose to have the flexibility next to the farm, because at the point of application, the GS2 payment was very low for low input grassland. If there's a low input grassland in SFI that is more flexible, I'll be looking at that. Obviously, everything changed yesterday, so there's a lot of different flexible payments out there, it appears. There were a couple of others that have been highlighted to me, which I can't remember the codes of, which looked, if you looked at the finer detail, they looked less draconian, and therefore you might get away with it. But as I've proved, that RPA, eye in the sky, will find you if you're doing it on a field that you shouldn't, because I was allowed to do it on that field, thank goodness.
Our last question.
Yeah, this has been inspiring, so thank you. But I do wonder how you're dealing with the plastic net wrapping issue. It wasn't clear if that is an issue for you. I asked specifically because I'm scything and baling on a small college former playing field here in Oxford, and we went to their the university's resistant materials department and asked them to come up with something for us, and they managed to win a competition with the outcome, but it's sitting gathering dust on a shelf somewhere. We haven't managed to get the demand or demand them to turn it into something that will, even if it doesn't help you, will help farmers around the country, because that's a huge issue. Any thoughts on that?
We're recycling. Are you recycling?
We're recycling with farm excess. But what I haven't tried yet, and there's one of my there's a local regenerative dairy farm that uses sisal string. I don't know whether that will hold up to the winter weather, whether it has the same, because that's is it a hemp or it's biodegradable. I'd love to move to that. I don't know if you can get the same tightness to the bale. It'd be great if you're storing it inside, and taking it out. But on this sort of system, it does need to have a tight thatch if it's going to be out there for 6 months in bad weather. I'd love to move away from that plastic, because even as best you do, when you cut it and you peel it off, it always feels there's just little bits kicking around. And yeah, but at least I've got rid of the black. That's good. No longer using black plastic, which saves a vast amount of money in wrapping costs, at whatever, £3, £4, £5 a bale. So.
Any other thoughts on that?
I mean, we don't have as much because we're only doing a month of it, but like true farmers, we don't throw anything away. We have used it to protect over the veg patch. So yeah, it's sitting around. I'm sure we'll find a use for it.
Yeah, we use Solway recycling. You can just get like bins and bucket bags, and we just fill that with those. And as long as they just want you to make sure that it's a single thing, so that you can't mix like your hay wrap in with something else. You just have to have separate bags for that. But yeah, Solway are pretty good. Okay, so I think that pretty much brings us to the end of this session. Thank you so much for your questions. And panel, thank you so much for your excellent expertise. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Claire. 14th of March at Garable Hall Farm in Cumbria. If you are in the Lake District, then do come along on the 14th.